Hello and welcome to our week on the American Revolution. Some of you might be wondering why in this Canadian history course are we doing the American Revolution? That's a good question. Um, the answer is fairly obvious, but maybe not that obvious. Um, it's a simple point, but in defining the kind of political boundaries that remained after the American Revolution, some of those territories remained British, and some of those territories broke away from Britain and became the United States. We live in the British parts. So that revolution and how it affected all those different parts really shaped us. It's also worth noting that after the American Revolution, about 40,000 loyalists came across the border into Canada, and that had a significant impact on the demography of British North America, what we now call Canada. It remained a largely French Canadian population. There were certainly some settlers, particularly in Nova Scotia, going into Nova Scotia just before the American Revolution. We'll talk a little bit about that. But largely, it had been a French Canadian population. And so suddenly this massive influx of loyalists from the American Revolution, British, Anglophone, Protestants into this territory, changes the makeup of the country, of the colonies, significantly. And there have to be political responses to that. And we'll pick that up at the end of the lecture. The slides here in the photos here are nice illustrations of the kind of the variety of peoples that participated in the revolution and the kind of variety of stories that we see in from a Canadian perspective anyhow. The Queen's Rangers were an important British ranger unit during the war, many of whom settled right here in the Niagara region. Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader, Haudenosaunee leader, settles as a loyalist, settles after the American Revolution in what's now Brantford, Ontario, in the Six Nations territory in Brantford. And Richard Pierpont is one of many African Americans who fought on the side of the British during the war. Pierpont's interesting. Again, another Niagara connection here. A man who eventually settles in the Niagara region, but born in Senegal or in the 1740s, but enslaved, freed, fought for the British during the Revolution, will also fight in the War of 1812 as a significantly older man. But we'll get to that later. But a really, really interesting guy. But he's one of thousands of African American loyalist figures who crossed the border after the American Revolution as well. So again, we see this kind of rich group of people, diverse group of people affected by the American Revolution and ending up part of the Canadian story. Today we're going to look at the revolution itself very, very briefly. Again, in these short videos, we don't have time to look at kind of any kinds of the details, but we'll look at a couple of the Canadian dimensions to the story. Then we're going to ask a couple questions. Why not Canada and why not Nova Scotia? In other words, why didn't they join the American Revolution? They are British colonies in this period. Why didn't they join the American Revolution? And you might think the kind of obvious answer is that they're not really British colonies like the other ones are. That's certainly true for Canada. It's less true for Nova Scotia because, as we saw, the Acadians were all expelled, and as I'll tell you today, many New England and European Protestant settlers move into that territory. So it looks more like Massachusetts, certainly more like Massachusetts than Quebec does. That becomes a slightly more interesting question. We'll pursue that, and that's your seminar readings tonight as well, for this week as well. And then finally, we'll look at the Constitution Act, which is the major constitutional political event for Canada that comes out of the American Revolution. And we'll talk about that at the end of this talk. So here's Eastern North America in 1774. See that enlarged province of Quebec. Remember, that was part of the Quebec Act in 1774. There's the 13 colonies in green, although look at Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia really is the 14th colony. It's now been part of the British Atlantic seaboard for over 65 years. It's been fully integrated into that economy. The fishing economies of Nova Scotia and Massachusetts are closely integrated. You have Massachusetts people settling in Nova Scotia. This is the territory that we're going to be looking at here in the American Revolution. So one of the first events of the American Revolution is an attempt by the rebels to capture two strategic British positions. And we know from the 7 Years' War that control of the St. Lawrence River, and therefore control of Quebec and Montreal, would be very, very important for supplying, manning, arming an army in the interior of North America. So the American rebels calculated that if they could capture Quebec and capture Montreal, they could actually effectively control the interior much more effectively, and that way limit the war to the coasts. They thought there was strategic advantage in that. So they marched two armies overland in the fall of 1775, one up the Champlain River Valley and the other one up the Chaudière River, Kennebec connecting to the Chaudière, going up to Quebec to try to capture those two territories. We know that these positions are hard to capture. For some reason, the American general, Richard Montgomery, thought it would be fairly easy to capture Quebec. He did so for reasonable reasons. He knew that the British had not reinforced the position since the 7 Years' War, and he knew that the troops there were not particularly large number. He thought he had a good chance of capturing Quebec City. And Montreal was a much smaller facility, much smaller city at the time. I wouldn't even call it a city. So they actually were fairly confident they could capture Montreal. They didn't capture Montreal, but they captured some positions around Montreal, did fairly well in those battles. Montgomery, on the other hand, did not fare so well, despite boasting. Never boast. This is a good lesson for all of us. Never boast. Boasting on his way to Quebec, he said, "I will have Christmas dinner in Quebec City, or I will have Christmas dinner in hell." You just shouldn't say things like that. Here's General Richard Montgomery dying in a battle outside of Quebec in 1775. Note the painting too. Remember Benjamin West's Death of Wolfe? Very similar structure, pyramidal structure, with him at the center, well lit. Again, a Christ-like figure dying. A martyr to the American Revolution. Quebec did not fall. It was a failed invasion. And the invasion at Montreal, while a little more successful, because they didn't hold Quebec, they knew they couldn't hold on to Montreal for very much longer, so they simply relinquished and went back home again. So one of the first actions of the American Revolution is an attempt to capture territory that would become Canada, but it fails. And part of the reason it fails is that they assume that the Canadiens, the French-Canadian population, would join them. They assumed that those people would rally to throw off the yoke of the British Empire. They didn't, and there's lots of reasons to explain that, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But certainly, it's a failure, and one with a nice Canadian dimension for it from our perspective. I also want to talk briefly about Indigenous participation in the war. In the case of the Mi'kmaq, we're talking about Indigenous non-participation in the war. On at least 3 occasions, the Confederate armies, the rebel armies in the United States, attempted to persuade both the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet, well, actually to the Wabanaki Confederacy, who we saw 2 weeks ago, attempted to encourage them to join the rebels in the revolution against the British. And again, they assumed, because the Wabanaki had this traditional antipathy against the British, that they might be tempted to join. And certainly the Americans were looking for Indigenous allies. The Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet want nothing to do with this. This is a war, I mean, I guess the colloquial expression would be that they had no skin in this game. They couldn't see any particular reason to support either side. They certainly had no reason to trust either side. And they weren't sure of outcomes. They didn't know where this was going. It's a war, as they saw it, it was a war, a fratricidal war, a civil war, which it really was, of course. And they didn't see any point to participating in this war. They didn't see any advantage to themselves in this war. So on all 3 occasions, they politely declined to participate in the war. The Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, on the other hand, they do participate in the war. and they don't participate completely consistently. The more easterly of the Six Nations side almost entirely with the British. The more westerly, some of them do side with the Americans, and this split causes a bit of a problem in the Six Nations, although that's healed over the course of the war. Longer story. But they are certainly vital military roles played by the Haudenosaunee during the American Revolution. The British lose, but it's not because of the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee provides very strong, very effective military support to the British. And it's important to realize, too, that they're not just providing military support to the British. They're providing defense of their own territories. The Mohawk, better than anybody, but the Six Nations in general, understood well that the place that they held between the British and the French before the 7 Years' War had changed. And they knew very, very well that New England, New York, and so on were looking west. They were looking to expand into their territory. So and again, the Royal Proclamation is important here. It sends a clear signal, the right kind of signal to the Indigenous people of the interior, but the Six Nations in particular, that the British will honor their place in that territory. So they certainly view the British as offering them a better chance of protecting their own interests in this story. Map here showing it's useful for us to remember where they were principally located. Certainly they would be in small numbers in the St. Lawrence River Valley, small numbers already into what's modern day Ontario, but really the heart of their territory, as this map indicates, is in upstate New York, in that area south and east of Lake Ontario. For those of you who don't know, the Americans win the American Revolution, hence the creation of the United States. And this is all settled in 1783 at another Treaty in Paris. Remember last week we had a Treaty of Paris, 1763. This one is 1783. This one settles the American Revolution. And it lays out the terms for the border that will exist between British territory, modern-day Canada, and the United States. And this more or less covers that territory. You can see the pink bit on the eastern side, on the right-hand side, is what's settled in 1783, and then most of the green territory is territory that gets settled in the years and decades, in fact, after the Treaty of Paris. So, our questions about why not Canada and why not Nova Scotia? Canada's easier. It was largely a French-Canadian population. They had no natural affinities with the New Englanders, with the New Yorkers, and certainly they didn't see them as allies, never mind having common cause with those people. Certainly there's a sense of suspicion on their part. New Englanders had been attacking Canada for 100 years. There have been ongoing border wars between Canada and New England and New York for 100 years. They certainly didn't suddenly view them as brothers in arms. That was not going to happen. But also a kind of indifference that they, like the Mi'kmaq in the Indigenous people in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, the Canadians didn't see any particular reason to support one side or the other. And those that did see a reason to decide looked at this, at the Quebec Act, and saw, well, here are the British willing to grant us reasonable terms. They have conquered us, but they're offering us a kind of self-government, a place in our own government. They're protecting our laws, protecting our religiosity. That's pretty good. And given that we don't trust the New Englanders, there's not a whole lot of basis there for joining the American Revolution. So the question of why not Canada is fairly simple, fairly clear, I think. Nova Scotia is trickier, though. Nova Scotia is a more interesting case than this one. It's a more complex situation. Why? Well, in large part, it has to do with what happened between the 7 Years' War and the expulsion of the Acadians and the outbreak of the American Revolution. In the roughly 15 years between the expulsion and the beginnings of the Revolution, the British have been sending settlers into Nova Scotia. You can see along the north shore of Nova Scotia a lot of Scottish settlers going in. Along the south shore of Nova Scotia, a lot of German settlers going in. And throughout the entire colony, a lot of American settlers coming into the colony. They're settling predominantly in farming areas, again on those older Acadian lands in the southwest of the province. Those old farms that were destroyed. Well, the farms were destroyed, of course. Only the buildings were destroyed. The fields and so on were fairly still in place. Many of the dikes that were protecting those fields would have been damaged in the process, but they could be repaired. So moving into fairly good farmland there. These census figures here from 1767, so basically right in the middle between the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. So there's still more Americans coming in after this, but it gives you a sense of the way Americans are dominating the population of Nova Scotia at this period. Way more than half of the population are Americans, and by Americans that means, for the most part, people from Massachusetts. Some people from New York, some people from from Virginia and other colonies, Connecticut. But most of them are coming from Massachusetts. And that's really, really interesting because, of course, Massachusetts is the heart of the American Empire. The American Revolution. It's really the center of revolutionary activity. Boston's the heart of the revolution very, very clearly. So it's interesting that these people who grew up in the same neighborhoods, grew up in the same villages, same houses, same families as revolutionaries in Nova Scotia choose not to rebel against British authority. So what does that mean? Well, your readings this week are on that exact question, so we won't talk much about that here today. We will point out one thing, though. They do, in small ways, rebel. And so the they is a bit of the problem. To speak of those Nova Scotians, there's a mixed story here. Some Nova Scotians do, in fact, rebel. Many remain loyal, perhaps most. But some do rebel. So this is the Siege of Fort Cumberland in 1776, where a combination of New England settlers, some Acadians who have escaped the expulsion, and some Mi'kmaq attempt to capture Fort Cumberland. Now, Fort Cumberland is that fort that was Fort Beausejour. It was the French fortress, Fort Beausejour, on the border between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It's now Fort Cumberland, and these rebel forces who are in communication with the rebel leadership in the United States attempt to capture this. Now, this is really interesting. This certainly wouldn't have converted all sides of Nova Scotia to join the revolution had they joined, but it certainly would have sent a signal, certainly to the British, but also to the population that might be sitting on the fence wondering which way to go. If you capture that British position, it might encourage some people sitting on the fence to tilt towards the revolution. So this might have been a very decisive moment. They don't capture the fortress. The British hold it. They maintain their hold on the position. But the simple fact remains that had it gone the other way, it might have been a quite decisive moment. Plus, you do see that there was at least some rebel activity. Most of this rebel activity came from this village. This is Majorville, New Brunswick. This is just outside. It's on the St. John River, just south of Fredericton. It's a congregational village, settled with all people from Massachusetts, settled in 1762. Deeply religious group of people. They build farms on former Acadian farmlands. Very prosperous farming area. Drive through there sometime in a family vacation or something like that. It's a lovely farming area. They do very well there. But they come from the revolution. They come from the revolutionary heartland, and they are unhappy with the way the British government is treating them in this new conquered colony. Now you might think, well, they're doing fine. What are they unhappy about? Well, they're unhappy about the way the government is being run and the limited role that they're being allowed to play in that government. And we'll just kind of leave that there for now. But it's fascinating that this small, deeply religious little center could play such a significant role, or could have played an even more significant role in the American Revolution. Here's a map showing those locations. FC is Fort Cumberland, right there on the border. Later on in your lesson, you'll see me talking to you from that very point. I recorded a little video there last fall. And the M is Majorville. You can see they're quite far apart, and you can see that there's no roads in that time period, so communications would have been tricky. That would have been a fairly difficult attack to coordinate. They're a long way away from Halifax. That's from the Royal Navy, away from troops. Troops would have had to march overland or sail around Nova Scotia, which would have taken a couple of days. So certainly they thought if they could get there in sufficient numbers, they might actually have a chance of capturing this position. The aftermath of all this. So the Americans win the American Revolution. What happens? Well, the most important thing is the arrival of the Loyalists. Approximately, almost 50,000, over 40,000 Loyalists arrive in the territories that remain inside the British Empire, which is Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Canada. Actually, New Brunswick doesn't exist yet. New Brunswick at this point is part of Nova Scotia, but anyhow, detail. Those territories, modern territories of Canada, remain within the British Empire. These are the people that were loyal to the British in the American colonies and who find themselves on the wrong side of history. So they cross the border as refugees into Canada between 1783 and 1790. Most of them right in 1783, by far the vast majority of them. There they're granted land, there they're granted a place in these new set of colonies and society that's being created. But look at these numbers. Approximately 35,000 of them go to Nova Scotia. Of those, a big chunk of those are freed African slaves. Well, they're not slaves anymore, they're free Africans, and slaves. So a large African-American population. About 2,000 of them go into what I'm calling here Eastern Canada, which is what we would call Quebec. And almost 10,000 go into Western Canada, of whom about 2,200 are Haudenosaunee, Six Nations people. You're looking at a fairly substantial influx of people at the time. Very few of them go into that Quebec heartland, which is the French Catholic part of what will become Canada. Most of them end up in either Ontario, what will become Ontario, or Nova Scotia. This has a massive demographic impact on these places. And it means that it changes the character of the population. It means that those people are looking for new things, new arrangements, new political arrangements. And it's also, I can't stress this enough, it's also really important to keep in mind that while we think of these people as loyalists, and for some people that means that they were like monarchists or something like that, but they're not. They're people from the United States, and they're people who grew up in a largely democratic society. They're people who had really quite remarkable levels of self-government. Their experience of government was largely based on self-government. They didn't want to rebel against the British. That doesn't mean they didn't support democracy. It didn't mean they didn't support local self-government. So when they get into Canada, they expect local self-government. In 1791, so 8 years after the arrival of the Loyalists, the British passed the Constitution Act, which is an act to create a constitution for not for Nova Scotia. This doesn't apply to Nova Scotia, but it applies to Canada, the former French colony of Canada. It's directly a response to the arrival of Loyalists in that territory. It divided Canada into two colonies, Upper and Lower. Upper Canada is modern-day Ontario, Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec. And lots of people get the upper, lower. You sail up a river, right? So when you're going up the St. Lawrence River, you're going towards Ontario, Upper Canada. Divides it into two colonies, Upper and Lower. Gives them separate assemblies. Each colony has its own assembly. Now remember from the Quebec Act, the Canada before, under the terms of the Quebec Act, they had a legislative council, not an assembly. So they're acquiring an assembly. And the new territory, Upper Canada, is being granted an assembly. This is really important. This is a basic democratic institution. Now we'll see in a later lecture that these assemblies are not as powerful as the assemblies in New England, and that's a direct action on the part of the British government to try to contain democracy, because what they see in the American Revolution is democracy being a little out of control, being too much. too much power to the people. So they're going to try to rein it in a bit in Canada. So they give them a democratic assembly, but one with fewer rights and responsibilities than they would have had in New England. Yet still, what you're seeing here is that, and this is the response to the Loyalists, they're dividing the colony into different territories, into a French Catholic territory and into an English Protestant territory, and giving them their own assemblies in those territories. They also give them separate legal systems. And again, remember, under the terms of the Quebec Act, the French civil law still applied. So in this new colony, Upper Canada, Ontario, you're going to have common law, the British system. So 2 colonies, separate assemblies with separate legal systems. Not just separate legal systems, separate forms of legal systems. One's a civil code system, one's a common law system. Completely different legal systems. This is political pluralism. This is the British. Remember I said this to you last week. When they looked at Quebec, they said, how can we offer them government that fits their interests, their needs, their cultural positions, their political traditions? How can we do that? And that's what the Quebec Act did for Canada. But in this new situation, they realize they have a divided population, so they divide the colony. They make one way, one the other. One to suit English Protestants, one to suit French Catholics. Broadly similar, broadly comparable, but they do so to accommodate the cultural and political traditions of each group. So what are the outcomes of the American Revolution? Well, it means that British North America is no longer a continent-wide colony. It's now a northern colony. It's just the northern half of eastern North America. It brings in this large influx of population of immigrants, the Loyalists, a refugee population coming in, radically changing the demography of British North America. The Haudenosaunee Iroquois, many of those people remain behind across the American border, still there today. But over 2,000 of them cross the border into Canada, and it means that the center of Haudenosaunee political activity becomes in British Canadian territory, not in American territory. And there you can actually see the shift from that area south of Lake Ontario in New York State to crossing the Niagara River and into the area around Brantford where they settle. And finally, we see this kind of sense of political, cultural pluralism. I would suggest to you that here, in these 18th century constitutional documents, the Quebec Act and the Constitution Act in particular, you're seeing the framework of modern Canada. You're seeing the framework of, I have to stop tapping that table. We're seeing the framework of modern Canada, where the basic political institutional framework of the country is being created. But it's not just a political institutional framework. That reflects the cultural traditions of the people in it. And that means that will continue to have an impact on how government officials, how government policy understands its relationship with people. And really what it means that here in the 18th century, we're seeing a kind of multiculturalism. We're seeing a kind of acknowledgement, an explicit acknowledgement that culture matters, that we can successfully accommodate politics to culture, that culture doesn't have to be something outside of politics, that it doesn't have to be flattened by politics, that different cultural groups will have different political expectations, and that you can still accommodate that within this kind of British constitutional framework.